name is Melanie O'Brien. I am the manager of the National Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act program, otherwise known as NAGPRA. We're here today to talk about what the session is titled A Progressive Approach to Repatriation of Sacred Objects. I had a good role in bringing these two presenters here together to talk to you today, but I had absolutely no role in them coming together to carry out this impressive work that they have done very recently. So with me today is Ryan Wheeler. He's the director of the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology at Phillips Academy, and Jaime Arsenault, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the White Earth Band of Minnesota Chippewa Tribe. And what we've come together today to do is to tell you a story. To tell you a story about a repatriation of 10 objects from the Phillips Academy back to the White Earth Band here in Minnesota. From my perspective as the manager of the National NAGPRA program, this story is not particularly unique. We process the work of repatriation for hundreds, thousands of objects every year. But I think that what is unique is an opportunity for all of you to appreciate a little bit the intensity of repatriation work if you're not engaged in it yourself. But also, I think I was most interested in sharing with a larger audience what is a really positive, progressive approach to this work. So my hope is that you'll get a little bit of a sense for what this work was, and maybe it'll inspire you to carry out your own repatriation work as well. To get started, I wanted to provide you with a little bit of the background. My role here is a little bit like the narrator of this story. I'm going to set the scene for you, and then we're going to move into a discussion, really. I have some questions that I have for both Ryan and Jaime about this work and the process, but then we'd also welcome questions from the audience as well. So to get started, we have to go back in time a little bit. It was in the year 1909 that a man named Warren Moorhead came to the White Earth Reservation. He was there in part to investigate what had been described as a dreadful situation on a dozen different reservations. He had been appointed as a special agent by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to travel to reservations and really evaluate the situation. He was there in part to investigate the theft of land, as well as many other thefts that were occurring right around the turn of the century on Indian reservations like the White Earth Reservation. When he was there at White Earth, he acquired several objects. These objects in particular that we're discussing today were 10 objects that included a birch bark scroll, a war flag, an altar cloth, several pipes, a beaded buckskin bag, as well as pieces of other pipes and pipe stems. This collection that he made when he was doing this investigation came back with him to Massachusetts. At that time, Moorhead was the director and curator of the Museum of Archaeology at Phillips Academy. And these objects he put into the collection of his museum in Massachusetts, where they stayed for over 100 years. Moorhead himself was well known as a collector of Native American artifacts. He was well known as an archaeologist who actively excavated and collected from Native American sites. He was not necessarily a professional archaeologist. He did not have a degree. He never completed his educational work. But he had a lot of good friends who were very interested in supporting his work as an archaeologist and as a collector. And one of those friends was Robert S. Peabody, the namesake of Ryan's museum, who funded a lot of the excavations and collections that Moorhead conducted. It's interesting to look into the history of Warren Moorhead a little bit, which is what I did a little bit. And there's some interesting stories. He has an interesting reputation as far as a turn-of-the-century collector. But again, I'd say that from my national perspective, seeing lots of these stories day to day in the work that I do, he's not particularly unique. There's certainly plenty of people in the turn of the century and well before that, and then for decades after, who were actively making these kinds of collections directly from reservations or from archaeological sites. So I'll leave the history of Warren Moorhead and his collecting practices there, and I would encourage you to do more looking yourself if you're interested in his particular story. But I think it's important to start with that background and to start to understand how this collection came to be under the care of Dr. Wheeler here, who was the director of the museum in pretty recently, right? Around 2016 when you guys started this discussion?
Yeah, I started working there in 2012.
What you can see here on the screen is a article from an alumni magazine for the Phillips Academy, which tells and chronicles this story of what is titled here in the article, The Long Road Home. So what I'd like to do now is kind of shift into a little bit of a discussion with Ryan and Jaime about how this came to be, how this repatriation occurred, where it started, and then eventually where it ended. So I guess I'd like to start by asking both of you to talk a little bit about how this initially began, because I think it's important to understand that the first time you guys perhaps discussed the collection was not an official consultation.
Through sort of a curious series of events, we wound up talking on the phone a number of times and emailing, I think, because Jaime was working on repatriation at UMass Amherst with remains from Florida. And before I moved to the Boston area, I was the state archaeologist of Florida, so I had lots of Florida connections. And somehow Jaime found out about that and got in touch with me. And we both had very tiny children that we were caring for at the time, which led to these conversations in various grocery stores that I can remember having, where I had my tiny child in the shopping cart going through Johnny's Food Master in Somerville, Mass, and talking about repatriation. And I'm thinking that the people around me must think, like, what the heck is this guy up to? And the tiny baby is there in the cart. And then Jaime has got her fairly tiny child, on the other end of the phone at a playground or wherever. So, and that was really conversations about Florida and being in touch with some of the non-recognized tribes. And then I don't think I even worked at Phillips Academy yet. So that was probably in 2011. And then I wound up working there, and it was clear that the institution had a long history with NAGPRA and being fairly progressive and doing a lot of work around affiliation, but that we still had a long way to go. And one of the things was education of our advisory boards. And so I thought, I can talk about this with our advisory board, but it'd be great to get somebody else to come and talk who has been doing this work. And so I thought Jaime will be a perfect person. And so we started talking about having you come over to do a presentation. And then in the course of those conversations, Jaime sent me a message that said, you don't happen to have any, I've been working with this tribe in northern Minnesota, you don't happen to have any collections from Canada or from Minnesota, Great Lakes? And I thought, well, I think we do actually. And so we produced some lists, and that was really probably the beginning of that conversations about the scroll and some of the other objects.
I think it was.
You can say what was happening on the other end of the phone.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, so I had started collaborating with White Earth at the time. Kayla Olson was TIPO, and I was assisting her. And we've since, I guess, switched positions. We still work very closely together, and Kayla's a wonderful, wonderful person. And so from the community perspective, there was, as Melanie had indicated, there was a lot of dispossession of everything from timber to children to, all those sacred things in between, right? And so the community had, not unlike many other communities, there's ramifications for that. There's consequences of that. And there's a lot of work that goes into trying to restore those things, trying to locate those things, trying to bring those things back, trying to nurture those opportunities for children. And so we, we'd kind of been tackling that from all levels, looking at language reclamation, looking at land reclamation. I see Maggie here with the White Earth Land Recovery Project, and so they've done a lot of work in that regard too. So it was, kind of like an all hands on deck sort of approach at the community level to try to bring things back again. And so where I sat, with Kayla, it was very much about, trying to locate those photographs, locate those sacred items, locate where those pieces of beadwork ended up. Because even if something isn't NAGPRA sensitive, the designs within them, I felt that the community has a right to access that, to see that, to continue to add the knowledge of what those pieces are and create new things, because culture is not a stagnant thing, right? And so if people have access to their own items, new things are created, new understanding is gained. And so there was this real intensive effort. So pretty much every time I was in contact with anyone from any museum anywhere, or even another community that had been traveling around, it was, this question of, did you see anything? Do you know of anything? Did you notice anything? And so the idea that not only did Ryan have such collections, but such significant collections, it was an amazing thing. I was going to go and participate in that conversation with the board anyway, but I think it was Halloween, right? It was right around like 2015, somewhere around there. And so I went and the whole time I just couldn't wait, to see, so I got in there and I seen the scroll, and it's like 9 feet long, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and I couldn't believe that it was probably hadn't been viewed by people in the community in 100 years at least, and so it was just this beautiful, powerful moment for me. And we immediately, we established that repatriation request is probably going to be something that the community would want to make. But we also started having those conversations about a loan. We started looking at what are our options, and how creative can you be if you've got two willing parties to get things done at a slightly faster rate. So even if it's loaning that item so that it can be used again, it can be viewed again, it can be, we had a lot of elders, not just in White Earth, but surrounding communities that really wanted to be able to see that scroll and view that. And I was really hesitant, as was Kayla, to postpone that, to wait that out, because the NAGPRA process, it can take a while. It can take, there's a long process involved at times. And So, Ryan was really receptive to working with us on that. And so I think it was right around Halloween, October is when I did that talk with them. We arranged a loan. By December, early to mid-December, we were driving that scroll back. And immediately it went into like a ceremonial type setting, where people from different communities could kind of come and they could see it and they could talk and they could pray near that item. And so that's how this started. It was a very fast turnaround. We immediately were in consultation with other communities, with the museum, and we proceeded with the repatriation request. And I think that was it was April 29th, so it was when that was finally published. And then finally, it was very fast. And then by May, I think that had already gone through for us. And so it was a very fast process.
That's great. And we can come back to the loan, because I think that's a really important part of this and what happened. Before we do that, though, I would like to talk a little bit about the scroll. And I think, Ryan, if you could talk a little bit about the scroll as a type of object that was actually broadly collected. There are many of these, and I think there's been some study and writing of scrolls like this one. And then maybe, Jaime, you could talk a little bit from the community perspective of what the scroll was and meant.
Well, and I'm not an expert on these Anishinaabe scrolls, and which points up the fact, and something that Melanie and I have talked about too, is that really most people that work at museums are really not experts on the objects that they're holding. And so I know that when the scroll went back, a couple community members shared with me other things that they had learned about it when they were able to turn it over, when they were able to work with it, things that we never would have really known. But these scrolls are part of the Medawawin. They're different types, and this one was like a master scroll that really contained a lot of information about an origin stories and migration, but also how to conduct the ceremony. And really, it sounded like at the community level there were none of these left, and they were probably very ancient. And when they were deteriorating, they'd be a new version would be made, like a new copy. So, the one that was in our collection was probably a copy of an even older scroll. And it wasn't sort of capable of being rolled up anymore, but it was in this long wooden case with very thin, fragile glass on the lid. And we did find a couple of really interesting studies that had been done. A guy named Selwyn Dewdney had been given some scrolls or acquired scrolls in the 70s in Canada that were very similar to this one, and had then kind of studied scrolls that were in museum collections. He didn't find out about ours, however, so ours was kind of really hidden. I've seen other drawings of some scrolls that look, very similar to the one that we had.
What did Phillips Academy do with the scroll from 1909 to 2015?
So the scroll was in this wooden case with glass, and at least in one vintage photo, we can see that it was hanging on a wall over a fireplace in our building. And so at some point, it was taken down and was in our storage. So it was primarily in storage probably for the majority of its time. But probably after it first came to us in 1909, it was out on exhibit in the case. And the case that it was still in had eye hooks where it was clearly had been hanging. And you can't see the scroll, but you can see a corner of the case, and I'm pretty sure that it's the same object that was basically kind of hanging there over a fireplace in our building. and then it was in storage.
I think, I don't have authority to speak to the details of the scroll or ceremony or things like that, but just, from the community perspective, to be able to have something like that home again, it was a really powerful thing. I was so thankful that the museum was willing to work with us in the way that they did, because there are elders that have since passed. A handful of people that were in that room that night got to see this, remember hearing stories about this from elders that they grew up with. They got to witness this, they got to be there for it, and they're no longer with us. But I think it was a really powerful thing. By contrast, there are several museums that have scrolls that have refused to this point to repatriate those items, and those elders kept asking me, can I see them before I go? And they didn't get to. So this moment for me was a really, really powerful thing, and I'm really thankful that we got that opportunity. The information contained within it, the size of it. So the scrolls I've probably seen about three or 400 since 2015, because once this one came, so many more came, and they're all in different sizes. A lot of times they're like the size of maybe printer paper, or they might be a little bit longer. Each one, it's like a chapter, right? It's like it has a little bit of information on it, and no two are the same. No two that I have seen are the same. And so when all of these ceremonies had to go underground, when things were illegal, when people had to kind of hide, and when Indian agents and others would come in, missionaries, and pull these items away, they're pulling away those chapters, those pieces of knowledge, and scattered it. And so we're still at this point where we're still trying to bring those items home again, those songs home again. So this was 18 feet of knowledge coming back at once. And it was, it was one of the most beautiful memories I have of, in my life. Having my daughter and seeing this happen, it was that type of, it was up there, and it's just the beginning. So for me, it was a really powerful thing, and watching those elders see this, it was a really powerful thing. There was information contained within it that shifted the way certain ceremonies are done, because some of that knowledge came back again. Like, we thought that maybe this ceremony started this way, now we see it does. So now they can kind of go back and make those adjustments, those enhancements, and kind of it's almost like repatriating parts of ceremony, that had gone away too. Because when all those things are scattered, you're in your mind trying to remember everything, trying not to forget everything. You're like, don't forget the language, don't forget the ceremony, don't forget the song, don't forget this. For White Earth, there's a story that there were 6 kids that were selected and told those stories, 3 in English, 3 in Ojibwe. Don't forget it. And I think some of those children were also pulled off to residential schools and things too. So those kids had to kind of try to remember those types of things. And so that's one of the stories that it's told. So there's a lot of hardship that was happening at the time this was taken, and then there was a lot of joy at the time that this was coming back. And so for me, that was, from the community perspective, for me to be able to witness that, it makes all this hard work worth it, because a lot of you that are doing this type of work, it's the years and years and years of consultation and, inter-tribal consultation too, right? And so to be able to see all that come to fruition, it's worth it. It's worth it. So those of you who are still kind of in the middle of all these different consultations right now, just keep at it, because it's a beautiful thing when it all kind of comes together.
I would add too that I think it's probably safe to say that the tribe has taken a lot better care of the scroll than we have, because when it went back, you connected with conservators from the Minnesota Historical Society who conserved it.
Yes,
and
Tom Braun.
Tom Braun, yeah. And that was something we had never done, and so that made more of the scroll accessible. And did you build a new case? I can't remember.
Well, yeah. So we're still working on the case part of it, because it was such a sensitive. We had Tom Braun come up from the Historical Society, and what he did was he worked with me, and he worked with several elders in the community. So it wasn't him repairing the scroll; it was all of us kind of learning how to do that. And so he used Japanese like mulberry fiber, and would cut it with water, and it can last about 100 years, but it's also removable. So if you have birch bark scrolls or pieces made out of birch bark that have certain kinds of tears, that's a really useful way to be able to do that. And so we worked for a period, I think it was like 2 or 3 days on this, and that was the moment when we were able to reinforce that scroll enough. We were able to flip it over and found that there was 9 more feet of information, and that's the point where, we had no idea, and so it was just like, you remember, right? Like, it was a beautiful thing. But yes, so a lot of times in communities, and even in White Earth, we've had these conversations where people are hesitant to repatriate something, hesitant to bring something home, because what if we can't care for it the way this museum can care for it? What if, what if it's safer there than here? And I go back and forth with people about that sometimes, because not every museum looks the way the Smithsonian does, that climate control, that this, that, and so I would say probably about half the time when I walk into these museums, I'm seeing areas that are not climate control, areas where there is evidence of pest infestation, areas where, I've seen baskets crushed under the weight of other baskets, and so they're not necessarily always caring for things better than we can do that. And I think we sell ourselves short sometimes, assuming that maybe we don't have this knowledge, maybe we can't do these things, maybe we can't, It was as simple as sending an email out to the Historical Society here and seeing, is there anyone that has specialty with birch bark that can work with us? And the answer was yes. And we were immediately connecting and working together. And I actually signed up to be one of the mentor-mentee type people here, and they placed me with Tom. Again, it was funny. It was like we can't get away from each other, but I love him dearly, and he's a wonderful person to work with. But yeah, so we ended up really working on that scroll, and it's better today than it was, when it first came home.
Yeah. Well, Jaime, you introduced some of your personal reflections and your personal experience in this process and what it meant to you personally. And I would ask, again, both of you to just reflect a little bit on the legal process, the community process. What has this meant to each of you as individuals?
You want me to go first? Okay. Melanie and I are on like a road show together. So we did a conference at the end of last month at the American Association for State and Local History. And we had like a really similar yet different objective there, which was really to connect with sort of other institutions that maybe had complied with NAGPRA but weren't really kind of actively doing NAGPRA. So, there's sort of a distinction there, I think, that may be less than subtle. And because we agreed, I don't know, about a year ago, that there were a lot of institutions that, for whatever reason, whether they were scared or just a lot of time had gone by and hadn't done what they could and needed to and should have done. And we were looking for ways to encourage people. And so the cool thing about doing that conference, and this one as well, is it's like an opportunity to reflect a little bit on this work, which often when you're in the weeds, you don't really think about the 30,000-foot sort of perspective. And we had just done sort of a series of repatriations over about 3 months, kind of one repatriation event a month sort of over the summer leading up into September. And what struck me was that, a couple of things. And one is that really it's these sort of relationships and networks that we're kind of like recreating a map of all of those networks that existed in the 19th and early 20th century with people like Moorhead. So Moorhead was plugged into this system of collectors and buyers and diggers and acquirers of things and institutions and individuals. And, this flow of people and objects sort of, kind of one direction. And what NAGPRA's done is it's created an opportunity to kind of reconstruct those networks in a different direction. And I thought that was really interesting. And so as these, if you just sort of stay in your institution and you don't really work on building those relationships or connections, you can't really do this. You can maybe comply, but you're not really, finding all of these little connections. And one thing, our institution, we have a lot of what we're calling split or shared collections with other institutions. And, just figuring that out, kind of untangling it, has been really challenging. But there's little pieces of information and really, pretty distressing sort of splits of individuals and objects among institutions that, we need to recreate. So we're sort of in a position where we're kind of forced to look at those networks. But, I think to do it, you have to kind of, sort of start building this web of people today. And what I thought at that meeting, a month or a couple weeks ago, really just a week, I guess like 10 days ago, was really like, we're in this really kind of amazing moment in time. So as our sort of institutional ancestors, as kind of archaeologists and museum workers, so our sort of institutional ancestors were the ones who removed people and belongings. But we're in a moment where we, because of NAGPRA, can return them. And how really powerful that is. It's kind of institutionally and sort of, historically, and for whatever reason, our predecessors 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years ago weren't able to, for whatever kind of forces were at work. But so it's a really amazing time to sort of work at a museum. And that's one of the things that sort of strikes me, I think, that we're in this really kind of amazing moment.
And I think, from the community perspective, White Earth isn't much unlike many other communities with all the dispossession, as I was talking about earlier. And so, we can have that conversation where we talk about colonization and genocide and dispossession and kind of like leave it there, right? Like, or we can try to bring some of these things back, address some of these things. And so in this particular situation, the story doesn't end with Moorhead carting that scroll off and nobody seeing it again. You know what I mean? The story, just the whole new chapter was just written because that came home again. Those ceremonies were refined a little bit in the sense of now we have a little bit more detail. You got to see all these people just smiling and happy and like a little bit of healing. It doesn't forgive everything that happened, but it doesn't end there anymore. You know what I mean? There's this little bit of healing that took place, a little bit of, we can see how we can work together. There's that little bit of hope there, like what else can we do now? Like now what can we do? And you could see that type of conversation starting to take place. Like, okay, we did this, now what do we do? Now what's next? And that is, I think that's part of what that scroll did to shift, a little bit of thinking and a little bit of the way the speech, the way people, the words that they used, when they were describing it. And so, it was a really wonderful time for us. And so, when we were looking at the repatriation itself, we were looking at the needs and the goals of the community, bringing these items back, whether they were NAGPRA sensitive or not. We're interested in bringing back songs. We're interested in bringing back photographs and, those beadwork patterns and of course, all those secret items, things of cultural patrimony, remains. We're all of those things we want to know, even for those things that do remain in museums. And so we do have some items from White Earth that are still there at Ryan's museum. We are working out a shared stewardship agreement between us. And so we have that relationship that keeps going. So even if we're not bringing something home again, to know where it is. So somebody can sit here and they can say with pretty, reasonable certainty, these are where our items are. These are the ones that we have. These are where they are. If we ever wanted to have something on loan in the future, if something really does need to come home in the future, we have those tools now in place to be able to make that happen. So we looked at that. I'm part of that Mukatu cohort. I see Trevor sitting right here. So I'm lucky to be able to be part of that as well, to start to shift how we're thinking about that internally and how we're saving that information. From an intertribal perspective, when we were writing this notice, and I know we were going to get to this, but so we have it up on another tab. But what we tried to do was we tried to, Moorhead's not unlike a lot of folks, and at the same time, he did talk about the conditions as being dreadful. So if I say the conditions are dreadful, I feel like, there's one response. But if this agent who comes to the reservation says it's dreadful, I feel like there's another level of I don't know whether it's credibility or whether it's belief or something that people might have when they read that. And so I used his words in this notice. The other thing that I tried to do when we were working together with Ryan to write this is under the history and description of the cultural item. It's 3 paragraphs down. We talk about how Moorhead spent time investigating various forms of land and other theft, during times of significant economic, cultural, religious oppression. We put that in there so that we could document what was happening at that time, so we could use this notice as a supplemental notice to other claims that we make in the future, saying during this time, this is what was happening. Widespread oppression, widespread dispossession. And we were talking about not just the White Earth community, but we started talking about how all these types of things were being experienced by numerous Anishinaabe communities. So we were trying to also make it a notice that other communities could use if they needed to, if they were trying to bring something home again, taken from the same time period, to say, that this has already been published, it's already been acknowledged that this is what was happening. So at every step of the way, from the community perspective, we were trying to bring things home again and make things whole again. And at the same time, we were trying to help whoever we could help along the way. From a museum and community perspective, we've just stayed in contact. We've written articles together and blog interviews together. We're working on an exchange with students so that we can start to bring students out and which I'm sure we'll get into that in a few minutes here. We also had Ryan come out and visit us. So, during one of our ceremonies, so he came out and he sat and he spent time with us. And so we've had this relationship that's just been building and building and building, and we've been doing amazing things together, I think. And so from the community perspective, it was nice because not only do they have this item back, but now they have this relationship with Ryan. So now this idea of museums, it's not black and white, right? This isn't this really, it's not as charged of a response that we receive from people. People ask, how is he doing, when is he coming back, and it's a wonderful thing, so anyway.
Thank you both for sharing both the experience but also some of your personal reflections. I think that for me, these are the kinds of things that I hear often in places like this, in the hallway, where somebody tells me about a really great experience they had, or how the actual repatriation occurred. That goes way beyond even the carefully thought out language of a notice like this. I just want to point out that Jaime and the White Earth Band did a lot to not only leverage a relationship, a pre-existing relationship with Ryan, and a personal relationship, but also federal grant money to both consult on the objects, but then to be able to rent a vehicle that was large enough to put the scroll in to bring it back.
Just large enough.
It was really, people were packed in like sardines.
So for both the scroll, but then also for the other notice with the war flag, I remember there was quite a bit of challenge with how big of a van the war flag was going to take up.
Right.
So, that kind of work, very detailed work involving measuring tapes and the sizes of U-Haul vehicles is an incredibly difficult part of this work that has to have somebody that does it, and then fills out the federal form to get the money to do that. So I think there's a lot here in this story, which is what caused me to ask these two people to come with me and tell you their story. But I do want to be sure we have some time if anybody has questions about a piece of this story that you heard or something you're wondering about.
That's a good question. So the question basically, if I can restate it, is would institutions enter into relationships with descendant communities in the absence of some sort of legislation like NAGPRA? Yes, and I think a lot about how NAGPRA has changed the field of museum work and archaeology. So NAGPRA passes in 1990, and this is sort of a moment, at least in archaeology, and anthropology, maybe was sort of on more the leading edge, where there is more of an attempt to engage with descendant communities and a recognition that you can't really do archaeology without engaging them, either in the United States or internationally. And I think you're right. NAGPRA sort of kind of disrupts what may have been a natural progression by sort of forcing people to talk to one another who may not have really been prepared to do so. And there's this idea in sort of postmodern thought of these moments in time, often sort of around language, where something happens and sort of creates this shift where everything's sort of different on the other end of it. And I frequently think that NAGPRA is a really good example of that, because it really has changed the way that archaeologists think to some extent. The Society for American Archaeology did a survey about repatriation a few years ago, and they asked questions, about people's attitudes on repatriation in NAGPRA. And what was really interesting was that there was sort of a generational shift that was demonstrated. So in the 90s and the 80s and 90s, when NAGPRA was first being discussed and passed, the majority of archaeologists were very skeptical. And there was a minority who sort of said, hey, wait a minute, this is probably something we need to think about. And now most people that are archaeologists may not really understand how it works, which is a little frightening, but they understand that this is, that descendant communities, really need to be involved. And there's been sort of a shift, and often it kind of breaks out generationally. I think it's an interesting question to think about. It's something I think about a lot. When I worked in Florida, we had an unmarked human burial law that kind of put us into a lot of conversations with tribes. And when I became the state archaeologist in 2004, our collections manager and I agreed that we needed to improve our agency's relationship with tribes, and that we were going to do whatever we could to kind of make that happen. And that was sort of, we recognized that repatriation was one aspect of that. And it was a way to sort of put us in, more contact, because we had state laws and federal laws that kind of required some of those conversations to happen. Anyway, well, good question. I don't know if I answered it. Maybe.
I think the other thing too that we had done together was when we had first started, just having these conversations. So you have your NAGPRA sensitive items, your non-NAGPRA sensitive items, right? There's plenty of museums that'll just grind in their heels and only talk about the NAGPRA sensitive items. They're not going to have that other conversation. I'm seeing more and more museums willing to have a more broader, I guess, conversation. And so, you know, for example, Ryan, I had asked if there are any photographs, and he said, yeah, you know, and there's box of photographs, and we ended up with those photographs. We've used those photographs in additional claims to demonstrate the situation, and we're successful. So, like, you know, it's a non-NAGPRA sensitive item, you know, although the content within it was deeply personal and deeply sensitive, and so we've been able to have those types of successes, you know, not just with Ryan, but you know, other museums. So I think that shift, they're starting to have, you know, once that ice is broken, I guess, right? Once those relationships are starting to be created, then we start to have a more broad conversation, and it's going beyond NAGPRA, I'm finding, you know, more often than not.
Well, we really don't know what we have in our collections, so having, you know, experts from, you know, the descended communities tell us is really super valuable. And actually, you know, I mean, you know, if we can get, you know, we actually are like actively looking for people to come and review collections so that we can understand really, you know, what these objects are. You know, who should we be talking to about them?
So I really like your analogy of the ice breaking and how that leads to, you know, the cracks just seem to keep shooting out to other institutions and other places. And I guess, again, from a national perspective, I would say that this idea of ice breaking to me looks a little bit more like an avalanche, and that we just see the pace of this kind of work and this effort increasing exponentially every year. And I think a piece of the puzzle that in part answers your question is that when you talk about the objects as opposed to the human remains side of NAGPRA, you really are talking about a lot of voluntary effort, both on the part of the tribe to start the process, and then the museum to actively engage in it. So I think that there's a lot of the return of objects under NAGPRA that is more of that voluntary effort or work that has a legal framework and a legal way of moving forward, but has a lot more to do with the people involved and their dedication to the effort. Whereas the human remains side, it's a little bit more of following that legal requirement and legal compulsion to complete the work. So I think that's, again, what makes this a very progressive story, is not just the relationship that Ryan and Jaime had that led to this repatriation, but really the openness to which you know, Ryan was willing to have White Earth come in and find the things that they needed. I think I do, before we run out of time, I do want to stress that the loan process that they engaged in, which Jaime has then replicated again, and I think is another very progressive way of conducting this. So immediately after seeing the scroll and identifying it, she was able to work out a loan with Ryan so that it could come back. And Jaime did the same thing with a drum, right? And under a loan agreement, which is a typical instruments that museums use all the time, that's why there's so many split collections. They were passing things around all the time. It's a typical instrument that tribes can use to then get the things immediately while the process of the actual transfer and the repatriation works itself out, and the object can come back and be used immediately. So, other questions?
We've just kept being in contact with additional museums, and we're able to locate other items as a result. And I don't really know how all those things kind of lined up. I mean, I have my suspicions, but they're just kind of, the universe is mysterious, I guess. You know, and it just kind of happened that way. You know, I didn't have anybody contact me saying they read the notice, but when I did contact other museums, I wouldn't be surprised if they did a quick search and seen, okay, that we've been active in that way. So that could have influenced their response somehow. There's actually a couple of repatriations that we've completed, in the sense that the I guess right of possession and all that was established back with the tribe, but we have yet to bring those items back into the community because we're still working through that. Whether they go right back into burial, like what is the best way to do that? So we do have those conversations. In the case of the scroll and other types of items, what I've done is per community request is those items have arrived in the community and gone directly in the ceremony to find those answers out directly. So in certain instances, that's what we did was, and we had, the folks that were there were from more than just White Earth. There were folks from Leech Lake and Red Lake and, up in Ontario, that everybody kind of came together and was there for that. But then those other items where I suspect they're funerary objects, we have yet to bring those physically into the community while we sort through the rest of that. And so we know that they need to come back. We know that they need to be cared for in a certain way. It's just ironing out all those details. So I guess, there are those moments where you just know something is an item of cultural patrimony. You check in with everybody, you check in with different elders, different cultural, spiritual people, and determine, okay, is this something that needs to come back now, so people can see this now and we can handle this type of just have that experience. And that's what we did. And then there's those other instances where those questions are a little bit more thorny, right? And the way that you handle it might be a little different. So we're aware of that, and we do try to take it on a case by case basis and what that item is. And I always check in with everybody and kind of try to follow that guidance.
Yeah, that's a good question, because this particular case is probably unusual in that we have really good documentation about provenience, whereas a lot of our collections we really don't have. Absolutely, and we do have those kinds of. One of the things that we've been doing, so in the 90s, they sent summaries to, tons of tribes. I'm sure you all still have those letters, right? No. So we've been trying to go back and recontact tribes where we think we may have items. In some cases, for some reason, they kept copies of the letters that they sent, but not the lists that were attached. I don't know why. But we recognize that we need to revisit those items, and in some cases we may be able to connect with somebody.
Thank you both again for sharing your story. I do want to leave you with a couple of places you can learn more. Phillips Academy did a podcast about this process and the repatriation, and that's available on their website, and then again the article as well. But I hope that this has encouraged you all to go out and find your own path forward, and challenge some of the ways that you can be more progressive in this work and in approaching repatriation, especially of these objects. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.